Pincetl studies cities, how they impact resources such as water sources and ecosystems, and how those resources are used by cities, where, by whom, and to do what. She focuses on quantifying resource flows, including urban-generated waste like greenhouse gases, and how institutions, regulations, and rules shape the way flows are appropriated and how cities are built and organized. She has created the first interactive energy web atlas that describes building energy use in Los Angeles County. Buildings account for 40% of urban greenhouse gases, and the atlas shows the relationship between building age, size, use with energy consumption, as well as energy use and socio-demographic characteristics in the residential sector. She also works to understand the water systems of Los Angeles County, which, crazily enough, has over 100 different water delivery agencies and 7 adjudicated groundwater basins. Dr. Pincetl assembles interdisciplinary teams of researchers to conduct this work. This includes ecologists, hydrologists, engineers. She was one of the main leads of the first Los Angeles County Sustainability Plan and is currently serving in the same capacity for the LA Department of Water and Power 100% Renewable Equity Plan. Dr. Pincetl is a California native, and she has written extensively on land use regulations, habitat protection, environmental justice, urban ecosystems, and water. She holds a PhD in urban planning from UCLA, a master's in cultural anthropology from UC Davis, and an undergraduate interdisciplinary degree in land ethics, an independent major she created while studying undergraduately at UC Davis. She's the author of 2 books and over 100 peer-reviewed papers and book chapters. She serves on boards and commissions, including the statewide Planning and Conservation League, and as president of the statewide environmental justice organization, Communities for a Better Environment, and as well as the Los Angeles Regional Planning Commission. She has a bunch of others also, but I'll stop there. So please let me get off the stage, and please welcome Dr. Pincetl.
Thank you, everybody, for being here. I really appreciate it, and for such a nice welcome and introduction. It's always odd to realize where you arrive after just doing things in your life, kind of opportunistically, and also motivated by passion and interest, and trying to bring about a better way to live on the planet. It's also sort of odd for me to be presenting this, this work we're doing, spending a little time in Manhattan, and I was joking a little earlier. I was like, what am I thinking? Either the work is completely anachronistic or way ahead of its time when you travel around some of the redevelopment that's occurring in this incredibly vibrant and interesting city. And at the same time, it is kind of a shocking place, a shocking reminder of the way in which a high modernist energy society can build and transform and create these astonishingly vanity buildings that require huge amounts of concrete and glass and steel, and require an enormous amount of HVAC to keep them habitable inside, since none of them seem to have any openable windows. So what I'm presenting to you is really work that we've been doing at my center for, let's see, the green button, for a little over a decade. This is my incredibly brilliant team that is made up of graduate students and staff researchers. We vary between 6 and 10 people who work at the center. Our funding is largely derived from state grants from the state agencies. California, we're very fortunate to be in California and that there is research money at the state level, but also then at the local level, like with the county and the city. So on the basis of the brilliance of my staff, I am able to present to you the work that we do. So our interests and concerns over the years have been, and we've done work on water and habitat and other things. Right now we're focused on this energy system set of research projects. how energy, electricity, and fossil gas powers domestic life. What the energy transition means economically, ecologically, and politically, and of course for equity, that is throughout the kinds of questions that we ask. And how energy for a safe and dignified standard of living can be generated, stored, and transmitted renewably and equitably. We are, contrary to much of what's being built in what we see in the redevelopment of Manhattan, working towards energy modesty and parsimony. And we'll walk you through that work and why we feel so strongly that that is the way in which the future has to be thought about and developed. So first of all, I need to ask a few questions of you all, because I'm going to be using terminology, and if you don't know the terminology, then it's kind of not very interesting or very clear. So how many of you are kind of in the energy world in terms of policy, infrastructure? Not very many. So let me go very quickly through this, and then that'll give you a context for the rest of the talk. So an IOU, which we have many of in the United States, Con Ed is an IOU, an investor-owned utility. It's a private utility whose regulators, the Public Utilities Commissions, and they have different names in different states, but essentially they're public utilities commissions that regulate these IOUs. Their jobs, they came about during the progressive era when railroads and other services were being developed by monopoly capital, needed to be regulated because they were charging rates that nobody could afford. So what a Public Utilities Commission does is ensure that the shareholders of the IOU get a decent rate of return, which is generally 10% across the country, that the ratepayer can afford their bills. So this whole question of energy burden becomes very important, and there are lots of debates around how you set your rates so that the energy burden is affordable. It's supposed to be 6% of income. And then enough money left over to invest in the infrastructure and keep it going. And one of the things that the PUCs are supposed to do is make sure that those utilities actually make those investments over time, which, as we know, is not always the case. So you have the IOUs on the one hand, and then you have POUs, publicly owned utilities. Those are municipal utilities. So I live in the city of Los Angeles. We have a city municipal utility called the Department of Water and Power, the largest public utility in the United States. And we have a number of projects with LADWP because the city has committed to go to 100% renewable by 2035, I think. And make sure that it's done in an equitable manner. That is to say that the burden of this transition doesn't fall on the back of people who can't afford it. Very, very, very difficult. Lots of reasons. There are community choice aggregators, CCAs, which is yet another weird wrinkle. The CCAs, which I won't talk about but are good to have in the back of your mind to recognize, are entities that have been created actually by the federal government. I think it was under Jimmy Carter actually, where they can purchase power, and the IOU must transmit that power through their lines, and they're responsible for the billing. And it adds this kind of weird competitive environment there that then falls in the lap of the Public Utilities Commission to regulate. How much profit can they make versus how much profit can the IOU make? It's an enormously contentious issue, as you might imagine. The IOUs hate the CCAs. They try their damnedest to put them out of business. And then there are co-ops as well. So then there's the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, appointed by the president, and they set national kinds of standards and rules. The Public Utilities Commissions, and then there are locally elected officials, including state officials that have power over some of these policies. So it's and this is kind of just the tip of the iceberg. It's a highly complex socio-technical system, right? You have the technical stuff of the grid, the distribution system and the transmission system, all that stuff. And then you have this enormous regulatory environment, and they are interactive and they co-produce each other, which is very important to realize because, and I'll probably get back to it again, these public utilities commissions that are either elected or appointed from 3 to 5 members, every state has one, have been regulating these utilities for a century. What does that mean? Or more than a century in terms of their relationship. They've grown up together, they're like this. And so any changes in that architecture of large-scale, previously vertically integrated utilities, they generate, they distribute, and they give you your bill. They're just very, very tied together. And so changing from that model to something like distributed energy resources based on renewables is really hard for everybody. And we're right in the middle of that intense struggle between the IOUs and those who want to move to things like community solar, distributed energy resources, microgrids, and the rest. You see it played out across the country. And so our work is really embedded in that whole environment of trying to provide enough data and information to local governments and to local organizations, EJ organizations, and environmental organizations, such that they can engage intelligently in this complex terrain and have enough data behind them to make their points around regulatory change. So California has very ambitious regulatory targets, economy-wide greenhouse gas emissions targets, reducing greenhouse gas emissions to 40% below 1990 levels by 2030. That's only 6 years away. Establishing integrated resource planning processes to implement greenhouse gas emissions targets. And then the interesting thing that is always left kind of at the side of the table, doubling of energy efficiency savings by buildings by 2030. As we know, in the United States, most of the building stock has already been built. There's a lot of it, mostly post-war, most of it cheap and fast. And that, in my estimation, and you'll see me talk about it again, is really the crux of the matter going forward that we are not talking about. We're talking about electrification of buildings, adding more AC on a lot of the buildings, but we're not talking about making those buildings perform better, so it's waste. It's a waste. 60% renewable portfolio standard by 2030, 100% by 2045, carbon neutrality and so forth. And California, like many states in New York, is moving toward eliminating natural gas end uses. Big, big, heavy lift. So we need to triple our current electricity power capacity. Triple it? That's huge, right? That's enormous. Harden the grid. Well, why are we hardening the grid if we could have distributed energy resources and microgrids? Well, because the utilities have not been paying attention to their grid for about a long time. Big fires in Northern California, burning down towns and killing people. That's because they did not invest in their transmission grid, and instead they chose to favor shareholder interests. It's been documented many times. I'm not saying anything out of school or that is inaccurate. A few microgrids are okay because right now, when you have to do a shut-off, PG&E will truck a diesel generator to the top of the hill, everything's burning around it, so that you can have some power. So they're reluctantly acquiescing to microgrids, and so on and so forth, right? Investments in the transmission system. As we know, the IRA is all about these new transmission corridors that everybody hates and doesn't want to have built, and there's gobs of money being thrown at them. So this is really a very important choice we have in front of us today. in terms of what kind of energy system we want and what kinds of Earth system impacts we're going to have. So the governor's plan, all this kind of rhetoric about living powered entirely by a clean energy grid, a smart grid. What a smart grid actually means is you're going to have appliances in your home that the utility is going to decide when it gets turned on and off, because that'll be a way to balance the load, particularly in periods of high peak. So if it's really, really, really hot and you have your air conditioning on, the utility may decide that, you know, to avoid a blackout or a brownout, they're just going to lower your temperature or heighten your temperature. It's hotter, let's put it that way. Yeah, so there's a lot of implications there about who gets to decide what their future is going to look like in terms of their end uses. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. We're going to replace ICE vehicles one-to-one with EVs, right? All of this kind of embedded assumption that basically business as usual in terms of high energy consumption, but everything is going to be renewable, generated at these gigantic solar fields or big wind fields, right? Wind farms. But basically, you know, we're not talking about thinking completely differently about what the energy future looks like. So where we started was about 13 or 14 years ago, and I asked a simple question because we were interested in these you know, end uses. In light of all these state regulatory targets, how much electricity and natural gas is consumed where, by whom, and to what end in LA? No data. They had big Gantt charts. You know, this much natural gas is consumed per year in LA County. Okay, this much electricity. It was baffling, actually. I went to the state's Energy Commission, which plans for energy plants in the future and growth of electricity consumption. It had no idea. It was not able to get the data from the utilities. So we allied ourselves with local governments and pressed the Public Utilities Commission to have a proceeding about energy data access, because local governments could not implement conservation programs or efficiency programs if they didn't know how much electricity or natural gas was being used to do what. They didn't even have their own consumption. That was like bewildering. So after a year, we were, the administrative law judge, it's a whole world of bureaucracy, determined that researchers with funded grants were able to request the data from the utilities, and they were obliged to give it to us. Well, at first they just gave it to you in a PDF. It's like, well, what am I going to do with that? I can't do anything with this. So there was another big fight to get it in a spreadsheet. I mean, it was just every single step of the way we had to really fight for that data in an accessible, usable form. They're considered confidential. They're like your health data, right? So you have to have a very secure location to store that data. If it gets out and you have a data breach, that's the end of the world, even though the energy companies themselves have had data breaches. The data must be aggregated if it's shown publicly, 15-15. So what that means is if there's one user that uses more than 15% of the energy in that geographical location, you can't show any consumption. So in LA we have refineries. They tend to use more than 15% of the energy. It masks everything else, all the residential and everything else. So there's a lot of issues behind that. Anyway, so we were able to get data directly from the Public Utilities Commission. I am immensely grateful to the staff there who enabled that. Knowing staff inside agencies is a really good thing to do, and establishing trust relationships. And now, as of 2024, we have consumption data, electricity and natural gas for all parcels in all of California, up to 2021. I think it goes from 2017 to 2021. So we are building a statewide tool for examining, looking at energy consumption. So we built these, as was said, two publicly facing web atlases showing consumption, and we're poised to go statewide. And because of the back-end energy data we have, we can build different tools, which I'll show you one of them pretty soon. So we can use the back-end data to answer all kinds of other kinds of questions, because we don't need to reveal customer information by looking at the patterns in the data at the back end. But we are also able to display consumption data. So all of our work is derived from the Energy Atlas data. It has monthly consumption data and then parcel data, and then we match those. So building vintage, very important, right? So we have tranches of vintage. Building size, very, very important. And use sociodemographic characteristics, including renter-owner, and add any geographic layer we can add on. So climate zone, Callan virus screen, which I'll tell you about in a second, and other customized attributes. So in the back end, we have pretty light, but you can see all of those attributes. They get processed, and we do the data matching, and then the aggregated statistics get sent to the Energy Atlas. I was going to say something, but I can't remember what that is. So there you have it. So this is the Energy Atlas, and you can look at it on the web. And it has residential, income, you have all these different attributes. This is just one snapshot. And you can see there's a scroll bar at the top. And you can, with a drop down. So you can do, the total consumption, you can do electricity or natural gas or combined BTU. You can do the vintage. You can do residential, commercial, industrial. You can do single family, multiple family. By city, by county, and in LA, because it's highly populated, we can do it by neighborhood. And then there's summary statistics. Now, you can see that that this is 2014, and so this next update will take us up into the 2021, I think. But you're free to look at it. You can do comparative things. You can look at one city versus another city, one geography versus another geography. And then we've built one for the Bay Area as well. Similar drop-down tables. And so for the Bay Area, we did it for the Bay Area Regional Energy Network, that is an implementer of energy conservation programs. So we work very closely with them about the attributes that we put into the Atlas so that they can target their programs specifically to the clients that they are looking for. So without this, they really just can't do it. And it becomes a very functional thing that the state should have built for local governments a long time ago. So I said that we could use the back-end data to construct other kinds of tools. And we built a LA County Community Solar Opportunity Map. We were funded by the state, the Strategic Growth Council, to work with CBOs, largely environmental justice organizations. There were 8 of them in LA County. And the idea was to co-create a web-based map, so public participation GIS, right, this old traditional thing now, to build a tool that they could then use to query where they could build community solar in their neighborhoods, largely renters. So we built this map, and we wanted to, in order to support this equitable energy transition in these communities where there's lots of barriers for individual building solar, either they don't own the building because they're renters, or the rooftops are in bad shape, they can't afford to upgrade the rooftop, they can't afford the solar system themselves, all kinds of barriers to participating in distributed energy resources. And so if you look at the map, you can query this map as well by all these different attributes and find places where community solar can be built. So carports or garages, churches, community centers, libraries, county facilities, large-scale churches, large places that have pretty big rooftops that are more publicly oriented. And what we found was that there was approximately 3.5 gigawatts of technical solar potential on these rooftops. And the cumulative production would offset the electricity use of all 365,000 renter households in the geographic area where the solar potential existed. Pretty impressive, right? Pretty impressive. We were surprised ourselves. And so what it means is the urban fabric was capable of providing solar energy enough to cover all of the under-resourced renters in LA County. But we found that the rollout of such a finding would be heavily constrained by utility and public utility commission rules. 33% of the total solar potential for the community solar would be constrained from development based on circuit capacities. Who establishes the circuit capacities? The utilities establish their own circuit capacities. And there is no transparency about how they do it, where they do it, and when they do it. So if you say to the utility, but we have all your distribution, we have all the distribution network for all of the utilities. And you look at the distribution network, you say, but look, look at this here. You know, looks like there's plenty of space on your line for this. You'll say, well, you know, you don't understand, and actually we restrict the amount of community solar that can be built in order to ensure that the grid is stable. Okay. Resilience centers installed behind the meter, so that's solar and batteries. 86% of total solar potential would be constrained from development based on Rule 21 limitations. Rule 21 is yet another arcane set of rules about how much the network can withstand. So you have to really scratch your head, right, as to what is the purpose and intent of PUC policies relative to satisfying the state's goals and their ostensible concern about poor people. So PUC rules do not permit storage to be installed as part of solar PV systems under community solar programs. I can do it in my own individual residence, but as a community solar program which is not owned by a specific individual, you cannot. And so they don't allow a single solar installation to function as both community solar and a resilience center. So there are all these rules that essentially inhibit a just transition that are embedded in the state's regulatory infrastructure for the utilities governed by the Public Utilities Commission. So and more, right? Those of you who follow energy know that there's this huge struggle taking place across the country around the net energy metering payback periods, right? And so the state of California, ostensibly a leader in solar energy and renewables, has now revised their net energy metering payback period. And yet, at the same time, they're moving towards increased electrification. It's so hard to understand what is actually happening in the state, other than I think my governor has lost his mind. Has appointed people who are not on board with his stated goals. So with the growing success of rooftop solar across the state led by wealthier neighborhoods, the IOUs, who really care about disadvantaged people, began to lobby the Public Utilities Commission to reduce the feed-in tariff paid for that solar. NEM 2.0 was a one-to-one offset, meaning the price of a kilowatt hour supplied to the grid was equal to the price of pulling one off the grid generation. And the payback period was about 6 years. NEM 3.0 introduced a reduction in the payback rate for solar of 75%. That's not trivial, that's really big. And PUC established a new rate, shifting the structure from net energy metering to net billing which means that the utility pays for the electricity at the wholesale rate, no longer the retail rate. And, boggles my mind, the energy sent to the grid varies upon the payback period on the hour of the day of the week and month, with 576 possible export rates. Quite impressive, right? Their machinery must be working very hard at the back end, so that the voided energy costs rates come up to about 25% of retail electricity rates during those same hours. So this twist towards kind of the smart grid also means that you can have 576 possible export rates. So if you call your utility and say, well, why did I have number 325 for my retail rate? Who's going to be able to tell you? Well, it was that time of day, it was at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and it was cloudy, and really? So I think that direction, this kind of the smart grid and the smart appliance and the smart meter and the smart this and the smart that, also means that it's a very opaque system. In addition to which, we are also going to be charged in the IOU territory, not in my public utility, fixed rates, fixed charges. So because the utilities are now needing way more money, because they're way behind on making sure their infrastructure is secure, we are now, their customers are now going to be charged fixed rates, infrastructure rates, depending on their income. They haven't figured out how to do that yet, but it means that with the intent to make sure that low-income people don't pay as much for their utility bills, they're going to have a steep rate increase for wealthier people to pay for the fixed charges. So that new transmission hardening, that new distribution system, and so on, gets attached to your bill. It's aside from your consumption, so that they will have enough money to protect people from wildfires. And of course, each of these is incredibly contentious. Then there's also the time of use rate, which maybe some of you have here in Con Ed territory, I don't know. But in California, when the sun goes down, obviously you have to have backup generation, which is usually still natural gas. And so what the utilities are charging you more at the end of the day when the solar asset declines. So imagine that, you're on a time of use rate. You have 3 kids, come home at the end of the day, you have lots of laundry, it's been really hot, your kids are feeling grumpy, you want to make dinner, you want to put on that AC, and your electricity rates are much higher. And so it's like blithely saying, well, you need a programmable washing machine so that you can start your washing machine at 9 o'clock at night, because that's when the rates are going to go down. And for dinner, I don't know, go to the mall or something, right? It's this very weird set of policies that are aimed towards reducing consumption. I see I need to hurry up because I want time for questions. So it's a really perverse, in my estimation, concept of equity. And essentially it points to an extremely anemic vision of what's possible, because you have these utilities that have been in place for 100 years, and you have lots of sunken assets. There's been this is a path dependency strategy, where the Public Utilities Commissioners don't necessarily have any vision of anything different, and they are certainly concerned about the viability of the utility. So deregulation with the rise of distributed energy resources have resulted in upsetting this traditional business model. And as we move forward, how will all of this play out in terms of regulation? And you have to also think for a second about the amount of resources, natural resources, minerals, metals, and the rest that are being mustered into building this new system out, right? It's not trivial in any way. So I'll be quick now because I've been talking too slowly. And one of the things that we did is point out that in LA County, the wealthy use 10 times more energy per capita than the poor. 10 times. Their houses are much more energy efficient per square foot because they're new and they've been built under the different energy codes that we have in the state. If we'd only kept houses at 1,500 square feet, as leaky as they are, we would still be using less energy today. So we have all of these ideas about efficiency, but we don't understand that efficiency gets overridden by size and consumption. And so there again, the policy is completely out of whack with the end goals, right? If you have a 3,000 square foot house or even a 2,500 square foot house, you're going to use more electricity and natural gas than if you have a 1,500 square foot house. And so we are not really grappling with the drivers of consumption. Oops, sorry. So we've brought all of these tools together to answer questions for the State Air Resources Board as well about what is going to be needed in disadvantaged communities. And it comes down to very nitty-gritty things like the size of your service panel. So if we're going to electrify everything as a business as usual path, EV for an ICE vehicle, induction stove for your gas stove, the whole 9 yards, most service panels are not going to be big enough. So you have to replace your service panel. That costs several $1,000s, not to mention all of the wiring that needs to take place. And for apartment buildings, particularly old apartment buildings, it's going to be super expensive. And who's going to pay for that? The renter? We already know that it's unaffordable to rent in LA, let alone in New York. I saw a place, a studio apartment, very nice, for over $5,000 a month. That's probably on the high end. But still, right? And then where are the people going to live while all this work is being done? This transition is gnarly. I'm going to skip these because they show exactly where we did my brilliant research director was able to do a spatial analysis of exactly where the panels will need to be upgraded. The amount of work that was involved in doing that is mind-boggling, and I can tell you a little bit about how he did it if you want to know, but it's huge. So in the regular single-family homes, not disadvantaged communities, it's less, but there's still quite a few. And so the implications, as I alluded to, are enormous. And so I have to ask, what is a realistic energy future? What is a realistic energy future? The realistic energy future is an energy future where we talk about modesty, a little bit more modest future about how much we're going to consume. And so we can't continue to allow a house to be as big as anybody would want. It's just not reasonable or feasible, and it's not equitable. And then we have to understand that the amount of money we're spending on transmission upgrades and the rest maybe should be spent on rebuilding our building stock so that they're thermally, they work thermally. So that when the time of use pricing is low, you do turn your air conditioning on. The building envelope will hold that coolness for a long time. So when you come back at the end of the day, it's not boiling hot, right? It's still cool enough so that you can wait a few hours before the evening starts and you can turn your air conditioning on. We are not thinking about thermal comfort. We're not thinking about people's everyday lives and how we manage things. I just said all that. And so transportation electricity, I mean, New York State did this incredible study that I'll show you a couple graphs. Some high demand charging sites could reach 40 megawatts in peak charging capacity by 2045. equal to a major industrial site's load. You guys, lots of transmission. So I was just like jaw-dropped by these charts. And you can access this online for New York. But a small town for passengers charging a platform, you know, you're driving down the road and you need to charge your car. And then there are these heavy-duty trucks and the light-duty trucks in your cars. And basically you need to have a huge amount of generation to even make any of this happen, not to mention in your cities. So that's kind of what it amounts to. So it's a little daunting when you actually look at what this transition needs to fuel it if you are going on this high energy modernist pathway. So we feel in our center is that we need to move towards energy modesty, energy parsimony, rebuilding the energy stock to be more energy efficient, to perform better thermally, keeping houses smaller, public transportation. We cannot really afford to go with this one-to-one switch between ICE cars and EVs. Simply moving to renewables is actually not going to be sufficient. And we also feel that the private utility model needs to be really rethought. And that's a big, big, heavy lift. Because what does the alternative actually look like? There's all this sunk infrastructure, century of regulation, but they are not going to be able to lead us to an equitable and resilient energy future. So we need to move to a distributed system, which is extremely complex, very, very complicated. And it'll involve different utility models, publicly owned, smaller scale. And thank you.
All right, everybody. We can take some questions now. We're going to take some questions now. Yes, way up in the back. And I think we need to run microphones up. So I'm going to give this to Jennifer.
Hi, thank you for your talk. So I'm curious in terms of the equitable energy transition. I think a really large part of that comes down to the actual work, the physical labor that needs to be done. A whole bunch of solar needs to be constructed, transmission needs to be built, batteries, etc., hardening. What type of conversations have you been having in terms of making sure that these are family-sustaining careers coming from some of these frontline communities? Are involved with apprenticeships or I'm curious to hear your perspective on that.
That's a really good question. We know from experience already that fossil energy jobs are better paying and largely union jobs. Solar jobs are not. I can put up a solar array. So it doesn't require a lot of skill. It requires being able to stand on a roof and not fall off. But all joking aside, it's a very, very good question. I do think that the transition is going to require a lot more electricians and the building trades, particularly if we move toward retrofitting buildings and making them thermally performing. That really requires skilled labor, which we do not have today, actually. And so there's a movement in the building trades and among people who are looking for this kind of distributed energy future to work together to train people in these skills. There are apprenticeship programs at LADWP for sure, but it is a very tense relationship and has not really, we're not finished building those bridges. Really good question.
Other questions over there?
Hi, thank you for that talk. So my question could be ancient history, but in our classes we learned about the decoupling model that California introduced for utilities and energy efficiency, and how the revenue of the utilities is kind of decoupled with how much they sell. I was wondering how that kind of plays into the utilities rate designing right now, and
Right. The utilities make most of their money on transmission and distribution upgrades. And so it's very much in their interest to have gobs of money being spent on transmission hardening and building new transmission. So yes, they become wires companies, and they charge for the use of those wires, like the community choice aggregators pay for the use of those wires. And so there's a fundamental contradiction, really, between the state's desire to have more solar and ostensibly distributed resources and what the business model of the utility is today. It's incompatible. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much for that wonderful talk.
Thank you.
I was wondering, in your time going from no data at all to developing the Energy Atlas, how has that information from your perspective helped to inform decision making for the different stakeholders that you talked about? Because I feel like these tools can help influence how we generate consensus among different stakeholders. So I was just wondering how that's played out for you. And then second, in terms of going to a modest energy future, how do we even start to begin that cultural change?
Those are two really good questions. So as for the first question, I would say we've had increased momentum relative to policy influence. We started from scratch, a tiny research unit at UCLA that hadn't worked on energy. Berkeley economists who've been working on energy for a long time really dominated policy decisions and structured cap and trade and structured all kinds of things that I think have been extremely nefarious. But we're not economists, and we're a piddly little group in Southern California, and all the decisions are made in Northern California. So it's been a long, long haul. However, I will say that we've had an increasingly strong relationship with local governments. There's a coalition of local governments around sustainable energy, and we work with a number of them and help them also craft policy statements and interventions with the Public Utilities Commission. We help them as interveners. We work with CBOs. We have a very strong relationship with local CBOs in the region. But this whole energy transition thing requires an enormous amount of expertise and lawyers. So it's very expensive, and we can't provide enough support for them to be very strong interveners. And then our relationship with LADWP, I think, is going to be transformative, actually. I'm extremely hopeful, maybe naive, but I think that is going to be, LADWP, if we're able to work well with them, will transform the dialogue across the country. It really will. So that's a really good question. The other thing is, as a research institute, how do you, and I think this is common for academics, how do you operationalize your research into the policy world and into working with groups and organizations? Because we aren't paid to do that. We need staff to do that. We need to write those white papers. We need to write those policy briefs. We need to go to testify. We need to do all of that. And there's we're not very many people. So it's a constant struggle and source of anguish in a certain way. And then your second question, was the big question, the really big question. Well, interestingly enough, I think more people are speaking this language. We were just contacted by people at Lawrence Berkeley Lab, big dog on the block, who have been writing about energy sufficiency. Because gradually it's dawning on people that this transformation, fossil energy is so energy rich and dense, it is not substitutable by renewables. It's just not. And so the amount of land acres, the amount of space needed to generate electricity by renewables is huge. And if you're talking about biofuels, what? Are you going to grow food or are you going to grow biofuels? Take your choice, right? Are you going to eat your... there's just no compromise, in a sense, right? So people are beginning to think about it, but, Biden's policy is all of the above, and we're going to gobble up lots of tribal people's lands and BLM lands. But we're going to do it with their consultation. And we're going to come to some nice compromise where everybody will be kumbaya and agree that those tribal people will have to sacrifice more land. That's my cynical. It's like, come on, you guys. So, sorry, that's maybe a little harsh, but that's what I think.
I have a question from online.
Yes.
What do you think about the huge drain on the energy sector by the crypto mining sector?
Oh, it should be illegal.
Hi, I'm a novice about these issues, but I had a question about distributed energy resources.
Yes.
I know people in that field think it's sort of the be-all, end-all to our energy problems, and I was wondering if you see flaws in that logic.
Sure. I think that we haven't quite figured out the infrastructure network of those systems, and they need to be coupled with storage. So the question of storage is still, I think, unresolved in the sense that we need to get beyond lithium batteries and have a more layered approach to storage. So one of the things about the lithium battery, and I'm not an expert, I'm knowledgeable, but I'm not an expert, is that they discharge very quickly. And so it's important to be able to have energy that discharges quickly for lots of end uses, like if you turn on your stove, right? It discharges right away. But there are other energy requirements that don't need that quick a discharge that could be supplied by different storage strategies. I don't know a lot more than that, but I know that there is work being done. I mean, there are flywheels that have been developed. I'm not a physicist or a chemist, and then there are other forms of storage. And so we need to develop, I'll be right with you, a nuanced and layered approach. And we are investing so much in this kind of short-term strategy that we aren't thinking more deeply about what it looks like in terms of the urban fabric, the distribution system, the location of these kinds of storage systems, and resilience and islanding and things like that. So thank you for that question.
So thank you so much for the conversation. Your speech, I think, was great.
Thank you.
And I come from the water space, but I'm always looking to learn. And what you said about the fact that, heading towards a renewable sort of world is going to take a lot more than what we think. It just makes me think about the people that are, and especially a lot of the youth that we work with, that are, some of them are on there's the administration new council around environmental justice. I think that this is a conversation that you need to have with them, because it sounds like you have a wealth of information to share. And I'm not saying that, we need to talk to everybody, but it's kind of like we do, though, because it's like everybody's, headed towards their own little thing and they're getting their funding for this and that, but like, are we working collectively together towards this, like, this way of life, this culture of life? And I think it's worth you having this conversation with those councils that are now made up that talk about these same issues that, especially I can think of a number of activists that are working around energy, solar energy, renewable energy, and they are not thinking about that. They're saying, no, we can just eliminate fossil fuel, and, and I've gone to several marches in which they're preaching the same thing. So what are your thoughts about that, and like how do you think we can actually approach that and get everyone on the same sort of accord?
Well, I feel highly responsible for my work and the knowledge that we have developed, and that I'm enormously privileged to be in the position I am. And my job is to the extent that I can, and I'm invited to do so, work with different groups and organizations that are interested. But I don't have the bandwidth to actually go out and create my own platform, if you know what I mean. But I always say yes when people ask me to come and talk, because I think it's part of my job, actually. So one of the things, just a tiny parenthesis, I'm trying to push LADWP into funding is a kind of Energy 101 class that we would prepare for community-based organizations and community members. What is a municipal utility? Where does it get its energy? What are all these poles and wires around you? How much does it cost? What are the jobs that are funded, that are in your community, that are supporting the system? What does it mean if we want to move to renewables? What does that look like? How much is it going to cost? The more energy you use, the bigger all of that is going to have to be, and the more it's going to cost. What are the alternatives? So we're hopefully going to be able to convince LADWP, because they're an engineering-dominated organization, that they need to develop these kinds of public education forums and have opportunities to discuss, because the more you do and the more transparent you are about the system and the difficulty, the more you bring your owners in. I mean, we have a municipal utility. It's amazing. It's ours. It doesn't belong to shareholders. It belongs to us. So that's my hope.
So we have time for one more question, Joey.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I had a question regarding what you said at the end about how the current system of private utilities and PUCs is outdated and incompatible with a just energy transition. And I was just wondering whether you could talk a little bit more about what an alternative would look like and what role private utilities will play in this future. And if it is transmission and distribution, how do we prevent further sunk infrastructure costs?
It's a really big, complex question. I personally think that we can no longer afford to have private utilities. But, I mean, I will confess I'm a municipal socialist, so I think that the people should own their utilities. Not that that's flawless by any means, right? LADWP's previous general manager got put in jail for corruption for 5 years. So it's not flawless, believe me. But on the other hand, there's much more accountability that's possible with a public utility than a private utility. So part of the challenge is to help people understand that these are life systems that we need to engage with and decide what our own future looks like, right? So the transition will take a long time. We think that we are in a climate emergency. Well, we might be in a climate emergency. It's a pretty long one because there's all those greenhouse gases up there anyway. They're not going away tomorrow. So this is a long process. And so we have to be determined to stick with it for the long term. And so for me, I think that conceptually, a different model would be for cities that are of sufficient scale to support a utility, or a region would be a better scale for a utility with, depending on the climate zone, because I live in Southern California, we've got lots of sun, right? But other places have wind and other resources, hydro, small-scale hydro. And to think about, well, where do we live, and what do we, how do we live with where we are? People talk about climate adaptation, right? Climate adaptation or mitigation. We aren't climate adapted now. I live in Southern California with houses that could be in Houston or Idaho somewhere, or probably in parts of New York. They're all built the same. They all plunk down HVAC systems. We need to partly just say, well, where do I live? Is it hot? Is it cold? Where does the wind come from? Can I create a berm that would shelter my house from the coldest winds? There's all kinds of techniques that we could implement that are not fast and efficient. They're slow and they're expensive, but they're expensive for the long term, which means that in the long term, it works, right? So we need to change our mentality about how we live where we live. We choose to live in places for lots of reasons, but let's live in those places and appropriate them as where we live and invest in them in multiple ways, including owning your utility and thinking about what kind of energy services are enough to have a decent life. Can I cook my food? Do I have enough hot water for my kids taking a bath and my taking a shower? Am I warm enough? Do I have enough space to have a decent amount of space, right? We've kind of lost touch with just being humans in places.
All right, I think on that, let's thank Dr. Pincetl again. I just want to also remind everyone that the next speaker series event will feature Dr. Catherine Calvin. She's the Chief Scientist and Senior Climate Advisor for NASA. It's going to be on Tuesday, March 26th, and the registration for that will be opening soon. So please stay tuned, and we hope to see you again.